Well, good afternoon. Hi, I'm Reverend Angela Wells Bean. I'm the Minister for Congregational Care here at Naples United Church of Christ. If I know you, then I'm really glad to see you. I'm glad you're here. And if we haven't met yet, I'm also really glad you're here. So for the folks who are new to our campus, just one really quick piece of housekeeping that can sometimes prove very important is where are the restrooms. And they are on either side of these doors, right on the other side of this hallway. So sneak out on either side if you need to make use of those. And we also we're live streaming by webinar. And so it's wonderful to have all of our folks who are joining us remotely this afternoon, whether you're here in Naples or part of the Naples diaspora. We're glad you're here with us for this timely conversation. I'm introducing our introducer, so to speak, because part of my role here is that I'm the clergy liaison to the Environment Subcommittee, and they're the ones who've organized this program this afternoon. And I want to promote one other thing that our Environment Subcommittee is doing, which is yesterday they issued the challenge to our congregation to try to give up single-use plastic for the season of Lent. So if you're from the Christian tradition, it's common for folks to give up something in the Lenten season, often a vice or an indulgence. And they're asking folks to give up as best we can, perfection is not the goal, but just improving using less single-use plastic. So one way to do that is to grab a reusable bag, which is also made with recycled materials. So grab a reusable bag so you don't use those single-use plastic bags wherever you do your shopping, and you can grab one or two or more on the way out. And then on the inside is a sheet with some tips on more ways that you can reduce your single-use plastic. So please don't leave this afternoon without grabbing one if you didn't get one yesterday in worship. And so I'm going to introduce Bill Robinson. He is a member of our Environment Subcommittee, and he organized this program for us today and brought these two incredible speakers. So I'll let him introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Angela, and welcome everyone. This is a great crowd. I know there's probably a few more on the parking lot. What you're going to hear today, I think, is going to open your eyes to one of the four major problems we have in Florida alone, and that's water. Too much, not enough, dirty, or clean. Well, we're going to figure out where the water can go or where to go, and I think you'll hear some things, and I've been impressed to hear this presentation from Lynn Martin and Dr. Judy Husson from the League of Women Voters, so I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Okay. You ready to go ahead? Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Martin, as you heard, a member of the League of Women Voters.
Can't hear you. Can you turn it up back there?
I'm Lynn Martin, member of the League of Women Voters Environmental Affairs Committee. And Judy and I are here today to discuss Accune, which is an interactive software modeling tool that was developed specifically to address the risks of flooding and storm surge on county and city infrastructure and personal property in coastal Collier County. In 2017, Collier County received a grant from NOAA as part of the settlement of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and the grant was to develop Accune. Accune is an acronym which stands for the Adaptation of Coastal, Urban, and Natural Ecosystems. A team of scientists headed up by Dr. Peter Shang from the University of Florida and by Dr. Mike Savarese from FGCU developed this tool over a 3-year period. It uses the best available science, and it has been developed to take into account sea level rise, flooding from intense rainy day storms, and storm surge, looking at 2020, 2030, 2040, 2060, and 2100. And you'll see pictures of Accune later, but it looks at 3 different projections of sea level rise, low, medium, and high. It's a static visualization that's based on certain pre-specified parameters It looks at nuisance flooding from tidal changes and rainstorms. The storm surge is modeled as a generic Category 3, and the sea level rise is using NOAA predictions. The model, as you'll see later, also has asset layers that look at the critical assets. So the fire station, schools, the city hall are all indicated on the map for use. It's a digital elevation model. It was created using LiDAR data, and it incorporates the attenuation effects of buildings and landscape, which is better than some of the existing models. And it makes it useful for adaptation and resiliency planning. The role of the Collier County League of Women Voters has been outreach and community engagement. We were instrumental at the beginning in bringing together the scientists in the county to actually obtain the grant. We've been involved with user groups during the development, and we've been doing outreach and presentations like this since the software was developed. We've held training sessions for county and city staff on the tool. Most of them had seen it prior to Ian, which you'll see. So we believe that ACUNE provides important information for addressing both the repair of the current storm damage as well as developing a resiliency plan for the future and preparing for future storms. And Judy's going to tell you more about it.
Hi, I'm Judy Hushen, and I'm one of the, that went 2 slides. Wait a minute, there we go. That went a couple of slides. If you hold your finger on it, it just runs away. ACUNE has a number of models that are built into it. These are some of the models. Some of you may recognize, if you're into this sort of thing, the names of some of the models. They have basically combined them with data that they have from the county. They have county LiDAR data, which LiDAR is when they fly with an airplane, they send sonic beams down and they get very detailed topography. This is much more detailed than the FEMA maps or than anything else you're going to find out there, because this was done, this is, as I say, off the county's LiDAR data. In addition, after Irma, the Army Corps of Engineers flew the coast, which went from the coast sort of into 41, and they did another pass of LiDAR. So that LiDAR is even more up to date than the whole county LiDAR, just so you could be the LiDAR expert. It's not a bathtub model. Climate Central is a bathtub model. It relies on digital elevation model, which is built on this LiDAR. The other thing that underlies it is information from the IRPTC on, and it's NOAA's numbers. These are NOAA's numbers. These are the 2017 numbers. Shortly, it's going to be updated with the 2021 NOAA numbers. But these are the sea level rise. These are in feet. And you'll see low, medium, and high. These are sort of 3 possible projections. We don't know where it's exactly going to go, and over 3 years. But you can see how they range. 2030 goes from 0.39 to 0.72 to 1.15 foot. We aren't even using those low numbers. The low numbers are too low, and we know that, because we have seen the new numbers. But they have to work with all of the mapping with the new numbers, because this sea level rise lies as a layer underneath everything else. And so they have to make sure that new layer is going to work properly. The other thing they do is every time they calculate the sea level rise in a storm situation, they use multiple storms. These are past hurricanes and their tracks. And this is a weighted set. They're from NOAA, but it's a weighted set toward the kind of hurricanes we're seeing today. We're seeing hurricanes that are a little bigger, slower moving. They get bigger as they get close to land. They tend to intensify. And as I say, they're slower moving and more intense. So this is what we're seeing. And this is a little bit biased that way, toward more intense, slower moving hurricanes. And for every point, it actually has created this sort of statistical analysis of what might happen. In 2021, a CUN was developed for Collier County, as Lynn said. And the League of Women Voters provided the beta testing, and it also provided a user's manual. And we trained local and county government folks to use it. We've done a lot of presentations. We've done assistance with press coverage, and we've helped the local government personnel to respond to specific questions. Sometimes we'll get the question asked and asked if we would respond. And we do. What happens in the city, we've had questions like, well, what's going to happen? What if we put low-income housing on this piece of property? So we looked at that piece of property with regard to the sea level rise and the storm surge, and we showed them the pictures of what was likely to happen in 2030 and 2040. And the answer was that was not a good place for them to put their money. But they had a good answer. They had a real reason when they went back and turned that site down, because people had been suggesting that site. We've also looked at the new hospital center, which is going to be built in an area where there is some flooding. And it's obvious that they're going to have to do some more work to alleviate what potential impacts the new heart center could have. The lakes that are behind what's now the Telford Center and behind the Wellness Center, those are stormwater retention lakes, and they aren't holding enough stormwater. So that's maybe something that has to be looked at. But the flooding is potentially there. What are the next steps with a CUN? Well, we're connecting with the researchers with Southwest. We connected the researchers with South Florida Water Management District. South Florida Water Management District has detailed maps of what happens during inundation. They know how to run the canals. They know how to run the weirs. And they study when it rains, what's going to happen to that rain, where it's going to go, how fast it's going to go, how high it's going to build up, and what kind of actions they need to take to slow it down so it doesn't flood communities. Well, they have done that, and they're now melding that with this so that we have this one is a storm surge, and everything comes from the Gulf. It's either flooding, sea level rise, or storm surge. Everything is Gulf-based. The inundation-based is the South Florida Water Management District. I have no idea what it's going to look like when it's actually together, but what's going to look like is when the water comes up the Gordon River and comes down some of those canals, which empty into the Gordon River, what's going to happen? We need to know. And that's what this has, will have the potential to tell the people what's going to happen under those circumstances. We're also looking at, we're going to include the new, as I said, the new 2021 IRPCC data, because those new data are more accurate and will give a little better picture. We know that sea level has been rising, and it about 5-6 years ago it went from like this to rising like this. Now it's up here. It's actually rising even a little faster. They have been measuring the rise at the end of the pier for years. They've been measuring the water level at the end of the Naples Pier. I don't know what they're going to do now. They don't have it at the end of the Naples Pier, but that has been the point for which it was measured. They'll have to find a comparable, but they will. That's not my problem. But we are seeing sea level rise. Sea level rise means that it not only comes up along the shore, it does, it kind of creeps up a little bit, but it also will come up in the lakes, because the lakes are surface water that comes up. When you dig a hole, the surface water rises to fill that hole. That's what happens. So those lakes, while they're stormwater lakes, they also are impacted by sea level rise. And this is one of the reasons that some of the stormwater lakes that were built 30 years ago are failing. They're failing for a couple of reasons. They're failing because there's muck in the bottom, and they're failing because sea level is rising. So and the rules have changed for how big a lake has to be, how deep a lake has to be, and South Florida Water Management changed that about 10 years ago, and how much water that lake has to hold. And so the old lakes weren't built big enough and deep enough to hold the amount of water that we're asking them to hold. So I know the city of Naples is working 1 or 2 lakes at a time to dredge out the bottoms of the lakes, to make the sides stronger, etc. One of the other problems is that the sides cave in. So some of that is putting riprap around the sides. Anyway, there are lots of different things. So what we're trying to do is identify vulnerable stretches of beaches. And that's another new model that'll be in there called X-Beach. And some of the people who work on the Coastal Planning Commission and things like that are very anxious to see what that model will bring. Ongoing education. We're doing what we can do. The state has asked for more information on 2040 and 2070 in terms of predicting vulnerability. And you'll hear that the county and cities are going to be undertaking vulnerability studies. Vulnerability studies are needed to say to identify what your vulnerabilities are, what might happen to you, what is likely to happen to you in your locations. And so that's what a vulnerability study will say. It takes into account where schools are, where hospitals are, where daycare centers are, where people live, where all those kinds of things. And they will get scores, and there is money available to do those studies, but you have to have this basic information first, and we already have it, thanks to a coon. Okay. Here you can see a visual of Irma, of Ian. This is Ian. As Ian was approaching the coast, you can see in a very light blue line, and I can see this light blue line here. That's the state of Florida. You'll notice that the hurricane is bigger than the state of Florida, right? That hurricane is fatter than the state of Florida is wide. Okay, this was approaching. It was coming up the west coast. There were problems, people, NOAA miscalled it at first. They thought it was going to Tampa. They called for evacuation of Tampa. They thought it was going to Sarasota. But we should have known anytime a hurricane comes up the west coast, especially a hurricane that's this fat, it's going to churn up water on the back end. The back end is what causes the storm surge, not the front end. It's the back end of the storm. This is a huge storm. It has a huge push of water coming around, and it's going to come around and come around for a long time by the time you take what comes around and pushes. As it moves, it was only moving at 5 miles an hour. That's not very much. So we actually had 2 high tides while Ian was off our coast. I just will throw that out. That's because it was moving so slowly that we had 2 surges. The first surge was much bigger than the second, but we did have 2. It had a forward, I guess here it says 8 miles an hour. At some points it was 5, I don't know. But it was a strong Cat 4. It emerged in Cuba, it grew, and it grew to a 4 shortly off our coast. Any storm that's to our west and is coming up the coast, as this was, is going to cause a storm surge. NOAA said, if you looked at the NOAA maps, 5 feet. Okay, for the Naples little section of the map. You know the NOAA map with the thing that looks like a teardrop? Okay, anywhere in that blue zone, the blue teardrop zone, is an equal percentage likelihood that the storm will go that way. The black line in the middle is not the black line in the middle that's most likely to go. And actually, NOAA is probably going to redo their maps because they are so misleading to people. They mislead you. You feel it's okay, it's going to miss me. Well, it isn't going to miss you, kind of thing. Anywhere in that blue zone is equal probability. And NOAA is right now investigating their calls. What happened? What went wrong? Why did we make those calls? It turns out that the model that was the accurate model for this hurricane was, again, the European model, which NOAA discounted. They used the US model. So NOAA was advising that it was going to Tampa and then to Sarasota. Well, as we know who got it, right? And Naples got enough of it. That's because it comes up the coast. We didn't get the direct hit. We didn't get the big bad direct hit, but we certainly got hits off the edge, and we got storm surge. And that was our. Now, it turns out that something else we're building into the next version of the model is to add to the height of the surge, the height of the tide. We had a king tide that morning. A king tide happens like twice a month, and it's our high tide. It's related to the phases of the moon. And when you have your high tide, it's a 3 foot plus tide and 3 foot minus. We have a 6 foot shift in tide when we have the king tides. Well, and so instead of, when they said 5 feet on the map, it actually hit at king tide, so we had 8 minimum. From the 2-day-old NOAA map, we were going to get 8 feet. Okay, that should have been enough that if anybody lives, up to at least 3rd Street, and you live in a low house or in a low environment, you need to get out of there. Whether they tell you to get out or not, go find a friend. This is when you call your friends. I think a lot of cars will get moved the next time too. There were a lot of cars that didn't get moved. People in the high rise that said, "Oh, we're fine. I'm on the 13th floor. I'm good." Well, yeah, they were good, but they lost 2 or 3 cars. So, you've heard this over and over. This is not new. And so we're going to have to come up with something else that we're doing. This is this path that the storm actually took. And you see it came up, and it kind of came up the west coast of Florida, and then it veered in. And that little white turnaround thing is the direction that it was moving, but that's also when the eye reformed. And that storm got stronger right there. With Irma, the eye reformed when it came up the bay, Naples Bay. The eye reformed when it was near Immokalee, and the back half fell away. That's why we didn't get a storm surge. We would have had storm surge if that hadn't collapsed. That storm collapsed. That was the fluke, not the storm. The storm acted just like it was supposed to. I mean, just like the characteristic storm acts. That storm did not. But anyway, this is a drawing of how, this is actually wind history, but it also gives you an idea of where it came from and where it was going. This is your forecast of Southwest Florida flooding as of early in the morning on the morning of the storm. And you will see that it's 5 feet plus for Naples. Let me find my pointer. Naples is right here. We have some 9 to 11 foot flooding right in here. As we move up toward Bonita, this is I think still in Collier County right here. We have an 11. By the time we get to Bonita, we're at 13 to 15 by the time we're up here, which is where it came in. We're at 15 and up. But we still had 9 to 11 feet. It was predicted by that morning. I hate to say it. This is they have done what's called hindcasting. And hindcasting is you run a model of the storm and you predict how high the water would come through the model. Okay. Then you go out and you measure the high water marks at the same point. So you GPS that point. And you say at this point, it said it was going to be 3.1 and it was 3.5. Or you said it was going to be 5.2 and it was 4.8 or something like that anyway. You have gone out and you have done detailed measuring. The picture on the right here is how well they agreed. That's not bad. They're a little bit off, but not bad. Not bad at all. The left is the left is giving you the tide, the height. And you can see the tides coming in, right? And then we had the high tide, and we had the storm. And this was observed and simulated, and look how well it matched. This was done before. This was NOAA, and that was for Naples, and they stopped doing Naples, but they continued to do Fort Myers. It looks almost like you just traced it as well as you could trace. These are some of the college kids. These are from FGCU, and they came down with their GPSs, and they measured. See, they're holding their hands up where the line is. That's a dirt line on the building that they're measuring. And that's where they were measuring various buildings and lines. And then what they were doing by that GPS, then they could run the model for that GPS and get the predicted. And then they could do the correlation, which you just saw. You just saw how well they correlated. So that these kids were in there, they actually had fun. They enjoyed coming down here and measuring heights. They did it for Lee County and they did it for Collier County. They did, and NOAA was out measuring as well, because NOAA had predicted levels, and they wanted to know how well they had predicted. As I said, they're back to looking at the drawing board. NOAA did not do so well in their predictions. Where they said 5, we had 9, 10. You know. Anyway, this is a map of sea level rise, and this right here is City Hall in Naples. Here's the Gordon River coming up under the bridge. This is Goodlet Frank. Okay? This is a 2030 medium sea level rise storm flood. This is predicted for a Category 3 storm. This thing's moving. The colors tell you how deep it is. The bluer, the shallower. As it gets toward green, which you see how it's getting lighter blue, and then green. Well, you see blues go, by the time it's getting to this color, it's at 4 feet. You'll see some of the houses have actually disappeared. They have been flooded through the house. That's what that's kind of showing you.
And this is what the city and the county had available to them before Ian.
No, they had this available.
This is the software map that they could have used.
This is what we want to use for resiliency planning. How do we avoid problems next time? So that's what.
Because one of the things you might remember is that after Irma, they put generators on all the pump stations and they raised them. But when you look at using this map, the generators were not raised high enough. So during Ian, they all got flooded.
That's one of the little tasks, raise the generators. But these are the kinds of things that are going to come out of this. Road heights need to be raised. I don't know whether that's not really on this. The hospital's right up here, but.
You may have the hospital on one of the other slides.
I think I may have it in one of the other slides.
Yeah, this is Creighton. You can see Creighton.
This is Creighton. This is Creighton Road, yeah.
In the storm. This
Creighton
is the high sea level rise estimate.
Is running right along here. Creighton's underwater, as are a lot of the houses along Creighton, as you will see. This is Gulf Shore. It doesn't look too good either, does it? And this was predictable. This is prediction. This is not measured. This is prediction right here. This is what we had before the storm. It's also what we saw during the storm. But so this is, and you can see there's another, this is RP, and there's another development in here that went under. I don't know what that development is called, but there's one right in there. It's above the airport. Let's go to the next slide. This is a little lower down on Creighton. Creighton is still coming down here. Here's Gulf Shore. This is Goodlet Frank. And this is the Golden Gate. And this is Freedom Park. This right here is the Conservancy and the zoo and the Conservancy. This is Royal Poinciana. There are homes in here.
And then you can see Anthony's Park.
Yeah, Anthony's Park. Anthony's Park was right here. That was actually the one area they were thinking about putting some new housing, building some affordable housing. This is what we showed them, and they said, well, we don't think so.
One of the problems that came out of all of this is that the evacuation zones are so large. So if they were going to evacuate, they evacuate west of 41. But as you can see,
this is 41.
Right, not everybody west of 41 is in an affected area necessarily. So that's why a lot of people say, well, I'm going to be fine, and some of them will.
It kind of worked until 3rd. After 3rd and 4th, it sort of street. It kind of started to flood. But on the other side, it didn't. And then we have, of course, the flooding that comes up the Gordon River, which comes into Naples. So we get it from two sides. Aqualane gets it from Gordon River.
One of the things the city has to look at is whether they have a shelter in a city-owned building, because right now, all the shelters are in county-owned buildings, so that they wait for the county to issue an evacuation so that there are shelters open for people to go to.
And they're going to have to decide. They may do what Marco did. Marco ended up calling a mandatory evacuation about 10 hours ahead of Naples. And then after the hurricane was underway, they drove around in these very high, they're almost like swamp buggy vehicles. They're very high, big, huge wheels, high off the ground. And they picked people up and they took them to a temporary shelter, which was actually in a little mall, a little shopping mall. But it was a temporary shelter. They weren't going to stay there until, they'd be there till after the storm passed. But that wasn't a long-term shelter. That was just to get them out of their houses, which were flooding. Marco Island, well, I do have some pictures of Marco. But this is nuisance flooding. We haven't really dwelt on nuisance flooding, but some of you have experienced it here. Lynn talked about nuisance flooding. Nuisance flooding happens when we get some rain, but we also have high sea level rise. It just so happens that's one of those high tide times. And you'll notice, can you see the blue? There's blue and green running down here.
And some of it's on Gulf Shore Boulevard.
Well, that's what this is. This is Gulf Shore Boulevard.
Right.
That's kind of what I'm trying to run my thing down. Well, I guess Gulf Shore runs here and then here. But they flood. We do have local flooding areas which flood with just rain. Down near the Naples dock floods as just with rain. Wynn's parking lot can flood. One of the areas we've been talking about is that the 4th Avenue North is where you get to the hospital emergency room. People might have to go there. People might have a heart attack and they might try to drive their car there. Well, that street isn't high enough. It's high enough for ambulances, it's not high enough for normal vehicles. So the hospital has done something. They raised the new emergency room several feet. I'd say maybe even 3 feet higher than the old emergency room. The old emergency room got some water. The new one didn't. You have to pull up a real hill to get up to the new emergency room. I mean, when the vehicles come in, it's ambulances only at that entrance. But when the ambulances come up, they have to come up and around. Take a look at it next time you're on 4th. But 4th needs to come up, at least as far as the hospital. One of the other things we learned was that the avenues that run through to the beaches, there are beach parking and stuff at the end of the avenues in Naples, or even on up. Wherever you have one of those openings, you have the potential to have rolling surge down the avenue. And that is what happened. And you may have seen, even if you weren't here in town, I believe ABC and NBC picked up the pictures off Fifth Avenue with the surge rolling down Fifth Avenue. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was waves. That happened on any of the avenues that went straight through to the beach. If the street didn't go through, it didn't happen. Water came in, but it was just a slosh. It was not a surge. So it's just something to know. If you live on an avenue, and there was also a difference depending on which side of the avenue you happen to live on. And that was due to the wind. The water came up and the wind blew it onto the north side. So the houses on the north side flooded more than the houses on the south side. Go figure. That was the wind. The wind was kind of a constant, strong wind, and it was forcing that water up. So, you say, but I live in my house is just as high as her house. Why did mine get flooded and she didn't? Well, that's part of it was that wind. Your avenues flooded, and then the wind pushed it onto the north side, people who live on the north side. So these are we're giving you our wisdom tricks of the trade that we've been kind of picking up. This is a little bit lower. This is,
City of Naples.
it's what?
Tin City.
It's well, this is Tin City. This is probably Goodlet
But
Frank.
this is nuisance flooding, so you can
This
see.
is nuisance flooding. This is what I was saying down near the city dock. You're getting nuisance flooding. Nuisance flooding happens with high tides and sea level rise. And if your drains are not high enough, it'll come back out of the drains and flood. And that's what happens. It comes back out of the storm drains. Storm drains can't relieve themselves, and it comes back up. They will have to be looking at this in, I guess, city and the county to see what kind of pumping and that sort of thing needs to be put on to get it out of there. I noticed in something that I saw from the city that they were going to be looking at a whole batch of areas within the city for redoing some of the storm drain areas. One was my corner, so I was actually anxious for that. But after, I actually called after all the water had gone down and everything. The water wasn't going down from a rainstorm. And it had filled up with silt and sand, and they had to clean out the sewers. They did it, by the way, they were there the same day. They were really right on top of that stuff. So if you have any problems like that and you see it, call it.
But you probably have heard that there's a proposal to perhaps put a multi-function housing and shopping area down by Tin City that's going to have Restoration Hardware, Whole Foods, and various things, and they're going to put in underground parking. But if you look on this, underground
That's
parking
Tin City right in.
going to flood even on a rainy day without even having a storm.
So this is a problem.
You know, it really gives you a sense as to where the low-lying areas of the city are.
Yeah, and these are areas that get flooded regularly. And they're going to get flooded more and more regularly. That's the other thing. As sea level rises, what happens twice this year happens 5 times a couple of years from now, happens 25 times 10 years from now, happens 4 or 5 times a month, you know. Instead of happening only at the neap tides, it starts happening, and the neap would be just maybe twice in that month it would happen. And then it starts to happen much more often. And we'll start seeing, if you see some of the stuff that they have done for the city of Miami, you can see the predictions for how many days a year they're going to get nuisance flooding. And you can actually push a thing along, you know, by the year. You can take the year and move it along, and you can just start to see, you know, well, this is 3 days. No, this is 8 days. No, this is 25 days. So that's the kind of thing. We have that same, we're a little bit luckier. We do not have subsidence. That's a good thing. They have that in Miami. What that means is that the land is actually sinking a little bit on the beach side. Our land isn't sinking. We haven't had subsidence. When the people come out and they cite a point and they cite a height, it's still staying there 5, 10, 20 years later at the same height. It isn't doing that in Miami. And that's another problem that they have.
You know, we've been meeting with the city of Naples and the city of Marco Island, and they're going to start using these maps as they think about resiliency planning and emergency planning for the future.
And Pelican Bay.
In Pelican Bay.
Pelican Bay is also interested in doing resiliency planning for their people. This is another one. This was that one we just had.
This is 2030 medium.
We just had that one,
That's
2030
nuisance.
high nuisance.
And then this
This is storm flooding, 2030 medium storm flooding. So you see it gets worse. In the storm, we do have worse.
right, and this one you can see
This-
where the hospital is.
this is where they're going to put those restaurants, right here.
So
This is St. George and the Dragon, folks.
the hospital, the city council members have looked at this when they've thought about the new heart hospital.
The hospital is
Yeah,
up
right
in
there.
right there. That's our hospital. And you can see how these lakes are just spilling over. That's what I'm saying. Their lakes, I think they're going to have to do some real work on the lakes and set up some pumps for their lakes to be more resilient for their infrastructure. I think we have one more.
But you can see how we can, zoom in to
Whoops. One more.
Whoops.
Come on, back. This one, if any of you have connections down to Marco Island, that's what this is. This is Marco. And this is Marco in just nuisance flooding. But you'll notice that Hideaway Beach has a lot of problems with even nuisance flooding. They go underwater entirely when we put in the storm. Marco Island is at about a height of 5 feet, at least this part of the island is. And so things go south pretty quickly. But that's one of the reasons they called for evacuations. Yes? Up in there. We haven't really looked at that in detail. Up to Wiggins, it's Collier. After Wiggins, it's not Collier.
There is a part of it that is Collier up to somewhere.
Well, I know that Lover's Key was kind of wiped out.
Well,
Am I not?
she needs
Oh, yeah.
to stand
Oh,
at the.
I'm sorry. He's saying that people need to ask their questions at the mic because the people at home can't hear you. I can hear you very well, but they can't.
My question was what happens a little bit further north as you're going toward Wiggins Pass. We've seen a lot about what's happening right in Naples.
And we don't
Lower
have those
Naples.
pictures with us. We didn't bring those. They flood off pretty much just like what you see lower down. It gets, the area, you say, well, what about Port Royal? People think, well, Port Royal down there at the bottom. Well, the houses don't flood in Port Royal for the most part. Some of the very old ones do. But the newer ones don't flood because they're set up so high. But the roads all flood out.
Yeah, if someone in Port Royal had a heart attack in the middle of a storm like this, they wouldn't be able to get to the hospital because the roads would be so flooded.
The mayor tried to go down to Port Royal during the storm. He couldn't get down there. He had to turn around and come back. Just thought so that's part of, and he was in a high water vehicle. He was not in his car. So we're ready to take questions. Come up to the mic, please. No, you've got to come across. No.
While you're coming up, I just wanted to comment. I have a personal friend whose house was destroyed in Aqualane Shores, and another one whose house was destroyed in the moorings.
Okay.
I assume from the surge.
Yeah, and they were from two different parts of the surge. Aqualane was the surge that came up the river, the Gordon River, and the other one was the surge, the moorings were the surge from the Gulf. Yes?
I wanted to understand more about LIDAR. I assume it's done after the fact, so the storm's gone.
No, it's done way in advance. They do LIDAR in the middle of the summer.
What are they looking at? The height of the water, the geography?
No,
of
they're
the-
looking at geography. They're looking at all of the berms, the heights of the houses, the heights of the roads. If you have, the heights of the dunes, all these things are in there as heights.
So then you do something after the storm, before and after, and make a conclusion? I want to understand what the
No,
data
well,
set's
that
about.
part they don't do the after. They did do it with They did do it with Irma because they wanted to see what happened to the beach. They specifically wanted to see what happened to the
How can you use
beach.
that data set to predict?
Well, what you do is you have a topography for the city,
Okay,
and then you bring in a storm surge of a certain height. And you have predicted how fast it's going to come in, how strongly it's going to come in, depending on all those, remember the spaghetti of hurricanes that we saw? Well, depending on those kinds of storms, it predicts how much water is going to come in, how far it's going to come in, how high it's going to be. Now, depending on if you have a great big berm, it's not going to come on that area, probably. Although, if it gets to the end, it can come around, it'll come into it. It's just the way it does. That's what happens with seawalls. But
it seems to me you need to have the after number to know that you predicted, and it.
well, that's what we did.
coincide.
They did go out and measure the after
Afterwards,
numbers.
okay,
But they
that's right.
measured the after numbers of where it went to.
Right.
The model predicted it would be here, and guess what? They went out and they measured it, and it was here, or it was here. That's what those kids were out there measuring.
One thing I have not heard you mention is Goodlet Frank Road and Gulf Shore Drive. Aren't they planning to raise both those roads? Or
Well,
did I hear that?
They
and
need
not-
to, and you're right. I think they will be planning. It's interesting because the city was only going to raise some of Gulf Shore. I think the council members have been reconsidering based on what they're seeing and saying, we really need to raise most of Gulf Shore.
And the other one was not airport, it was Goodlet Frank.
It's Goodlet Frank.
Yeah.
Goodlet Frank has some low spots in it. For some reason, it was built with some low spots.
Yeah.
There's also a low spot on 41, right where it makes the turn. You know, 41 turns and goes from 41 east to 41 north. Right there is a very low spot.
If you were here in the early 70s, if farther north more dirt road existed. So as they built sections of the road, they didn't use the same standard, was probably the reason. And I think you're going to see, similar to a floodgate at all the avenues. And we may even lose a lot of beach access as a result of this.
One of the things I've been talking to them about is instead of just having a nice park at the end with a little step up and over, taking and planting things like sea grapes. Sea grapes withstand just like mangroves do. You're familiar with mangroves. Okay, planting them so they're like this, so that you have to walk up and go a little bit, do a little bit of a jig-jag so that you can get over. That would help to protect, and it would cut down the storm surge because you would actually have a solid barrier. Right now, we have something that looks like this. But this would give you something with a little more resilience to storm surge. That's what I was trying to think, because, you know, we don't want to put up barriers.
No.
But a natural barrier could cut down the storm surge. And what happens with a natural barrier is it breaks down. A storm surge is a giant wave like this, and it hits something and it collapses. And it still has the water going in, but the water isn't up here, it's coming in down here.
Those of you that are familiar with Park Shore Drive, up at Bel Air, which is a parallel block off of 41, the street Bel Air north of Park Shore, first floor units got flooded out. The units south of Park Shore did not because of what she mentioned with the wind. When the water came halfway up Park Shore Drive, and then there were some interlakes, but the wind is what pushed up to the north side of Park Shore Drive, not the south side of Park Shore Drive. And if
You have to think of the storm in terms of how big it is. The bigger it is, the longer it's going to last, the stronger it's going to be on its surge, and the slower it moves. When I showed you that picture of the storm overlaying Florida, do you remember Hurricane Charlie? Charlie fit in the eye of Ian. Charlie was a little teeny tiny hurricane that went it moved it really fast, and it went right across the state really fast. And that was part of what happened, because it didn't have all this extra wind it was pulling with it, and all this water it was pulling with it, and all this stuff. It didn't, it just.
I stayed here during Charlie. It didn't seem that calm at that time.
Well,
But I was here during Ian. How many of you stayed here for Ian? Oh, okay. I suggest you go to YouTube and look at some of the newsreels. I mean, there are some shots up in Fort Myers that this wall of water comes down this street and goes right and left, and the cars went this way, and houses
well,
broke
the
apart.
direct hits are much harder to
Yeah.
deal with.
Yeah.
But we weren't dealing with a direct hit. We were dealing with the cusp. And the cusp, you can survive a lot better than you can survive that direct hit. That direct hit, you don't know how powerful it is and how it's going to hit exactly. But when you're on the cusp, as we were. It was just, we were just getting the edge of the storm. We weren't getting that eye. The eye is the strongest, and that's where the biggest winds are. We got outside winds. And with Irma, it was a windstorm for us. It was not a surge storm, because it was going to be a surge storm. How many of you remember they were saying 16 feet? Yeah. Okay. That's when it was running up the coast. Remember what I said when a storm runs up the coast? Well, it shifted, and then it ran up Naples Bay. It hit Everglades City, it hit Chokoloskee badly, because that's where it first came ashore, strongest. And then it made its way up Naples Bay and kept going. And as I said, it broke down over Immokalee, and it continued on as a heavy rainstorm. But that was what it continued on as. It was not the punishing winds. It didn't have those winds anymore.
There was a third effect, because as it went up to Immokalee and that went up into I call the mouth of the Peace River and those rivers, and it stopped and flooded, and all that water came back into, that's where Fort Myers got hit a lot more in the Cape Coral area, was the backwash also that came
That was
back.
the back as it got wet.
Yeah.
That
And
was the water coming down. They had 25 inches of rain in Immokalee. That was when it collapsed. That back end collapsed. All that water that was in the storm just.
And that's ironic, because they average about one boil water notice a week for fresh water.
Yeah. But
Anybody
anyway, I
got
just
anybody
thought
else
I'd
got questions?
say that.
Anybody else got questions? Judy and Lynn, thank you very, very much. How soon before you think you'll get the update?
Well, the city council is meeting on the 1st, and we expect them to pick up the model at that point. And it'll be about 3 months after that everything will be incorporated into it.
Do I understand that there's no resistance to this direction this study's taken?
There is some, I mean, there has been some pushback from the
At the
county.
county.
From the county.
Not the city.
Okay,
Not the city. The
that's
city has been
yeah.
very pro. They're worried. They want to do their resiliency planning.
Yeah.
And they have a new resiliency officer, and they're going to have this resiliency officer work with each of the departments to determine how what you see up here can be used to do their job better. This is fire, and it's police, it's the emergency management, it's the stormwater people, it's all of these groups, the utilities. They all need to look at this with regard to what their facilities and their jobs are.
Well, the city fathers believe in protecting our backyard. The county commissioner believes in NIMBY, not in their
NIMBY.
backyard, not in their yard.
Okay. But I'm just saying, the city is taking a very active role with this right now, and we've had great support from the city council, and I expect that we'll see something on the 1st. And then it takes about 3 months for them to, after this contract is signed, for them to get the work done. They're going to put a new Google map under it. This is a 2017 Google map. They're going to put a 2023 Google map under it. They're going to use the new 2022 heights of sea level rise that NOAA is using and predicting for our beaches. So there are things that will be incorporated that'll make it better.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. And maybe you'll be here next Monday too, where we're going to talk about more housing issues. Same location. Thank you again.